That's funny.
So I'm
One of
Thomas,
you.
that's Shay. Shay uses he, him. Shay, what do I use?
Use they, them.
Yeah. We are Cool Zone Pod on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and most podcatchers. We kind of consider ourselves like Maoist dirtbags. Is that a fair assessment, Shay? Uh, to be fair, we're MLM PM, meaning Maoist, Leninist. Fuck me, Marxist, Leninist, Maoists, principally Maoists. Meaning we really love the writings of old man Mao Zedong, but also agree with much of the Bolshevik line up to like the death of Stalin, and before that with Marx and Friedrich Engels. Shay, what
Want me
kind
to
of
get it?
content?
Well, it kinda depends. Sometimes we do history stuff. We've started a series on the history of liberalism up to Maoism. We've also recently started a series on our Patreon exclusively, the history of evangelicalism. Sometimes we have guests on, and sometimes it's just us 2, having a little banter, having a little good time. So it's a variety of content, but, mainly with the Maoist lens,
Wake
so
up, liberal. I love you.
Yeah, and we do also bring interesting, critiques to the table, of contemporary life or, like, the name is Cool Zone, and that was inspired by a tweet that kinda went big on Marx's Twitter a while ago that I don't have a link to that talks about, like, we live in the cool zone of the history books, which is to say it sucks to live there, but it'll be really great to read about in 200 years. Um, and that's
Does
that's
that mean
kinda
it's
how
gonna
we
be
look.
horrible but fun? Like,
Exactly. And
oh
that's kinda how
no.
we look at it, is that, like, you know, it's a good time to compare to times before, kind of
Mhm.
for analysis, and we try to use just a wide array of critical theory to do that. Like, I come to the left generally, but mainly, like, Maoism through, say, a lens of liberation theology, like the Sandinistas and stuff, and I know Shay has a very different angle on religion and stuff than that, so we do well.
We got varied takes.
Wonderful. Um, so let's see. Why don't so we've gotten the shout outs, right? You guys are the cool
Wake
zone. We
up,
got
liberal.
Shay
I love
and
you.
Timothy. Is that right?
Thomas. You got it,
Thomas.
it's Thomas.
I got the T. Good enough. Um, so I think originally this started because I posted stuff about reformism on Twitter, and a whole bunch of people from the revolutionary side of the left got very mad about it. That's probably I want to say where you saw this stuff, or maybe in my Discord or something along those lines.
Uh, yeah, so, uh, in the majority of my time, I kinda moderate a Discord called Socialism 101.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the guys are listening now, they'll probably ping in a second, and call me a
Mm-hmm.
dumbass. But so, we
Based.
have a few people there who just, I guess, are chronically online,
Mm-hmm.
and so they told me that on Twitter you were seeking a Maoist, or that you were just very much a reformist, and I was like, "Oh, this'll be fun."
Yeah, that's kind of the take. So I guess if we let's put it like this: what are each of your what do you think like the strongest argument in favor of revolution is? What do you say, as opposed to like a reformist approach?
Well, I mean, revolution's happening right now, right? Like, if we look at the Philippines and we look at India, the Maoist parties in both countries are engaged in active people's protracted war and aren't doing that poorly, all things considered, right? Yes, the Indian Maoist Party has lost a lot of turf over time, but they're coming back and they're coming back very strongly, and they're doing well at combating imperialism within their own communities. They're doing well at fighting to bring back workers' rights to the plants and places where they work. But most importantly, they're fighting foreign imperialism, which helps provide them a stronger backbone um, to work within their own country, right? And especially in the Philippines, we're seeing a strong resurgence in the Maoist party there. And we're seeing them have a lot of successes combating, Chinese imperialism over Filipino firms. We see where the Chinese capitalists have really done a number on their environment, um, with, like, oil work there, and mining operations that are kind of fucking with the jungle and stuff. So these guys, these fellas, um, I mean, even just recently, they raided a Coast Guard base of the Philippines, right? Very modernized Coast Guard base. The Coast Guard was drunk, and the fellas actually just nonviolently took them over, and stole all their shit. And I mean, full support to them because
Well,
that's a revolution.
sure. So the answer number one is revolution is happening, right? Like it's a reality. What would be your answer?
I kind of just take the basic approach that like evolution is much more effective at one achieving like the level of change we want, right? When we look at
Mm-hmm.
reform, it normally has to go through this incrementalist process in which there's so much pushing against like the capitalist forces for like we want this, but the capitalist forces want this, and so you have to push for
Mm-hmm.
each increment that you want. And what's more, I think that the kind of revolutionary state and the revolutionary struggle is much more secure against those outside capitalist forces for securing the change that's desired, right? Like a lot of times throughout history, we look and we see the reform happened and then it was pushed back against, and then reform happened and then it was pushed back against. And none of it kind of really challenged actual hegemony that capital has over everyone's lives and didn't achieve a substantial enough change to really impact the material of the people involved. Uh, and also historically, when you look at revolutionary states, when you look at the Soviet Union
Mm-hmm.
and China, eventually they did fall to those capitalist forces. You really see like the concerted effort that the imperial core had had to make in order to topple those states versus what I mean if we just a little bit reform all it takes is a fake election, a law, right? And then those things are done away with. So I think that the revolutionary apparatus is one um, much more apt to make bigger material change.
Mm-hmm.
And two, I think that it's more secure against opposing capitalist forces opposing that change.
So sure. So these are all I think like strong arguments, or at least interesting. I definitely don't agree with them. Um, I figure so. I Why don't we start on the first one, which is that it's like happening right now? Because my understanding is that all of the Maoist movements are in like pretty severe rollback. Um, like Maoism in is it Ecuador or Peru? One of them has been just like utterly obliterated. They used to have like 40,000 members. Now they have like 100. Um, I know a little bit more about the Naxalites, the Maoists in India, and I know this map comes from like a terrorism consultancy, and you just see these like incredible rollbacks over time. And again, this is just data on like the Naxalites over time in India. Um, like the by this number, like it looks like the number of civilians dying. I know that civilians dying isn't like the point of leftism, but if it's like a metric of how many people the imperialist core is like worried that like the leftists are attacking or whatever, it went from like I don't know 2,000 in the 90s to today it's like 250. So like a tenfold reduction. Um, I think it's very hard to look at these numbers and say, hey, this is winning. And we've also just not seen any real like the only socialist revolutionary success since 1990 has been in Nepal. Every other one seems to like have failed. Like they're in these like at best like 30, 40 year long civil wars. Um, so I guess the question is like if it's happening, is it winning? Why would we think it would change?
Well, that's part of the nature of the, protracted war, right? Is that, you know, do I anticipate any of these comrades succeeding within the next 5 years? Maybe not, right? But that's okay because in their active, combat, right, in this ongoing rebellion, I mean, just the one in the Philippines has been going on for, like, 50 years now.
Yeah,
Like,
but that's kind of
protracted
the point,
war
right? Like
can
if
take
it's
for as long it's gonna take as long as it needs to take because what they're doing is they're improving the lives of their people. Over time, while there aren't as many active conflicts, they're getting more and more direct in these conflicts, right? These conflicts are going from taking an axe and swinging it toward the foot of the empire, toward using a needle with a poison and injecting it into the empire more thoroughly, right? Because what they're doing is they're educating, they're creating these strong mutual aid bonds at lower levels in villages, in cities, improving people's daily lives, right? So that generations can benefit and prosper. And at the same time, they're engaging in this warfare as part of the mass line, right? Because at the end of the day, what we're aiming for with this warfare isn't just to win, isn't just to win in the immediate or in the tomorrow. It's to create these um, structures that can function on behalf of the people alongside and against the existing imperialist structures, these capitalist ones, and combat them while upholding the people to a stronger degree. And that's
Well,
where we are seeing a lot of success. We're seeing a lot of success in these mutual aid type things in India and in the Philippines under
well,
their respective Maoist parties.
then I guess to step in, it seems like the 2 points are one, it'll take as long as it happens, and two, we're improving like mutual aid. We're building what Lenin and like anarchists have called dual power, like a dual government sort of structure outside of the state. So point two, I'll get to in a moment, but for point one, if the protracted People's War, if we're talking about wars that are going to take like 50 years to win, then it seems like the argument that like, hey, maybe it will that revolution will achieve success quicker than incremental reform doesn't necessarily hold quite so strongly. Like if you I need to wait 50, if I need to wait till 2050 or 2070 to see like Maoist America, what could we've achieved with 50 years of reformism?
Well, I mean, I don't. It's like, Shay, do you want to take this one or?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we want to look at it from the lens of like how much material impact, how much material good is being done unto the people in these countries,
Mm-hmm.
there's only so far that reformism within the capitalist system can go to actually improve people's lives, right? When the reform is coming top down from the imperial state in the United States or just any
Mm-hmm.
satellite states outwards, they're not going to go that far to actually help people in their own country at least escape from the alienation, and the devastation that capitalism causes. Whereas when we have these Maoist parties, say in the Philippines and in India,
Mm-hmm.
they're benefiting people's lives much more closely and much more strongly, in these areas that they do have control. Right, mutual aid is a very strong thing, and it's very effective at combating
Well, I guess
alienation. Not
the
fully, obviously, but
to get in on the second point, then the question is, why do these mutual aid structures need to be like violent? Why do they need these guns? Why do they need to kill people to maintain like their legitimacy? Why can't there be like a non-violent form of dual power?
because the capitalist state will shut them down, right? Like uh, groups and institutions of mutual aid that work outside of, again, the capitalist system and kind of challenge the efficiency and the way in which that system can provide for the population have to be eliminated. If you don't have any resistance, any outward push from these organizations, then they're not going to stick around, at least on a large scale, right?
I mean, maybe, but so the analogy I would draw, right, is like in the imperialist core or whatever, the average state takes about 40% of GDP and pays the vast majority of that, like 37% of that, goes to social welfare. So it seems like capitalists can have a lot taken from them, and they aren't fighting back with guns. It's hard for me to believe that you couldn't take 1% through like a non-violent mutual aid sort of thing, and then suddenly they'd get out the AKs.
Well, it's not like it'd be armed like frontline conflict. It would just be destruction from within, or just a way to minimize the efficacy of said party, right? So the welfare that
Sure.
is being
How is the
provided at
violent
the
one any
expense.
like stronger?
Oh,
Like
okay.
what
Well,
what is it the
here's like,
destruction within? Like what is it unique
yeah,
about the paramilitary structure that makes
yeah,
it harder to destroy from within? These sort of like
yeah,
other ways that things are
and
destroyed.
I hear you on that. And and I have two examples of this, right? The last major Maoist movement in the USA, largely would have been considered like the Black Panther Party, up to the death of Fred Hampton, right? And what do we see there? We see that even as the Panthers engage in building this dual power, um, in places where they do so initially peacefully, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
thinking of Southern California mainly, we're seeing this, even as they're feeding the poor, even as they're, going into impoverished communities and helping students and helping single mothers, they're helping people get off drugs. They're helping people, combat addictions, etc. We're seeing that the police are harassing them, right? And now, yes, part of this can be put down to, say, racism, etc. But to a larger extent, what we're seeing is uh, that these systems, such as the police, such as your local damn transit authority, such
Mm-hmm.
as um, the United States Constitution, are inherently designed to uphold a certain bourgeois line, right? Now, often that line is they themselves, right? For example, the Constitution comes out of a bourgeois revolution, so of course it's going to uphold at every step the class which holds the means of production, the bourgeois class in this state. But furthermore, the enforcers of it have to combat at every step whatever dual power would try to raise. Because if it didn't, then it would have to concede something of itself, wouldn't it? Because they would have to conceive that it wasn't doing enough to help the people, which it claimed to help, which, if we're believing liberalism, right, then we're saying that government by the consent of the governed has to mean that the governed are being helped by it or they wouldn't consent to it. And if the government allows then for another structure to rise up, which would help people more than itself, then we're going to see clearly that what we're consenting to isn't helping us enough, right? And so this is why they have to go in and fight them, and this is why they have to go in and work against them so strongly. And so that's one example. But another example that's far more intimate, is, I work with my local Food Not Bombs. And when we go out and feed people, Food Not Bombs isn't armed. Food Not Bombs isn't militaristic. Food Not Bombs
Mm-hmm.
actually isn't even Maoist. It's just a bunch of anarchists and me here anyway. And when we go out there to work, we're just standing in a parking lot that we have permission to be in, and everyone's socially distanced. We're wearing masks, we're wearing gloves, we're spraying Lysol, and we're just passing out food to hungry people, hungry kids, everybody, and
Mm-hmm.
helping them. And then every time, every time that I'm out there, the cops will roll by. It's been weeks in a row, middle of a damn pandemic. The police have nothing better to do than come by and harass us for feeding the poor. Well, why
Sure.
is that? It's because they can't accept that we're out here helping these people, um, and they as a structure exist to oppress, and the structures that they serve can't allow for someone else to rise up to help people, or else they would lose something. They would lose the legitimacy, right?
Well,
Um
then to return a little bit, right? So when you look at the fact that the police in the United States are so right wing, when you look at the fact that I think the estimate is that veterans are like somewhere between 8 and 15 points more Republican than the US as a whole, so substantially conservative. For police, I think it's even more actually. Um, it seems like the idea of like a broad based revolution where you don't need to fight the military is extremely unlikely to happen. The military doesn't seem like it's going to fracture like you had in Russia, and there's going to be a big leftist contingent. So when we're talking like, let me put it like this: do you think this theory of revolution applies at all to like high income countries like the United States?
So now here's one thing, right? If we accept the premise that statistics which are taken
Mm-hmm.
based on a liberal framework of liberal countries, is the best way to go about it, then I would still say, yes, actually, revolution is the best because, of course, as we know, uh, his identity, man's reality, right,
Mm-hmm.
is shaped by his material almost exclusively, and
Well,
anything
that one
beyond that.
actually is an interesting one because I don't think so. Have you heard? I don't. I've never read Althusser, so I don't know if I'm properly representing him. But I don't think that the idea that material conditions determine most of ideology or determine most of how societies run is true. There's actually like a very simple study that I could show that, like in the United States, income is very uncorrelated with people's support for various policies. And there's even a fun study that people in the poorest countries in the world are most in favor of free markets, and people in the richest countries are most in favor of like government regulation. It's not entirely clear that material conditions is the main determinant of ideology. I
But
can,
I'm not sa but there's 2 issues there with that statement, right? There's the idea foremost that what I'm saying is it's going to determine your whole reality, right? But now, yes, you're right. Ideology is a powerful, counter lens, right? But we have to analyze what that ideology means in context. If, right, I run, the racism factory,
mm-hmm.
then it's not
A good
only
job, a
in my
well-paying
best
job.
interest. Yeah, I mean, it's a good job. Hey, the racism factor, is good, right? It employs this small community, um, and it employs the majority of the people in this community. Now I ask you, if an outside force comes into the racism factory and says, "Hey guys, pack up the racism. Actually, that's not good anymore. We're going to change it into a dick sucking factory." Then everyone at the racism factory is going to be pissed because their means of production up to this point has been based exclusively and explicitly in this one system. And now I'm telling them, actually, we're going to change to another system, and also the one that you believe is bad. A famous American once said, never assume any man will understand anything that his livelihood relies on him not understanding. Because what we're looking at here, right? You're saying, oh, well, the military or mainly vets, notably mainly vets, are rather right wing. Well, yeah, because when veterans in the United States come out of the army is the most socialistic thing in the United States. Not that it's socialist, it's imperialist, but the socialistic, right? It's planned. It's regimented. You're guaranteed to have food. You're guaranteed to have shelter. You're guaranteed to have certain things in exchange for a very predetermined amount of labor. They've had years, right? At least a tour. To be a veteran, you have to have at least seen active combat. Most of these people have spent 2 or 3 or 4 tours because we're in a forever war. So you have people that can spend upwards of 20, 30 years in a system that guarantees they are fed, guarantees they are clothed, guarantees certain things are going right, that their material's pretty good. And then they come back and they're immediately struck with, the fact that there is no, net for them, right? In the military, there's a strong net that you could fall into. Yes, there's a high ceiling of ability and capability for you to have, but there is a high floor for competence and for what gets done for you as well. And so when you leave that power structure, right, if there's nothing to stopgap that, then you're going to have a great decline in your manner of living. And as we know, when people experience a steep decline in their manner of living rapidly, they're going to become more reactionary because that will, I would say beat
So
out the liberalism, but it removes the center.
So I was just pulling up. I don't know. I don't have the difference between veterans and active duty, but I do know I have like a few polls just of active duty people, and they're very Republican as well. Um, so I think
Well, look at here's an interesting stat for you to look at that I know you can
sure.
pull up that'll be cool. If you were to look at vets donating to presidential candidates in 2020,
Mm-hmm.
you would see Bernie Sanders was the most donated to by active duty service people. Not
That
active
could
duty
be
officers,
right.
but active duty service people. But this goes in line with what you're saying about reformism, right? If there is any value to a person like Bernie Sanders, it is in a reformist model. And what you have to understand is the officer corps is always going to be the most polled out of any military group because they are the group that we have the best numbers on. They're the best educated group.
Well, the poll I just provided actually breaks it down among officers and enlisted
Yeah,
in
but
2008,
it's
which was a
true.
bit different than modern ones. Back
Yeah.
then, 22% of officers said they liked Obama, 24% of enlisted said they liked Obama. I think that there, I agree that there's probably to some degree that veterans leave the military and they aren't cared for by society, and that radicalizes them and makes them like dissatisfied. I could totally believe that. But among active duty people, it seems like conservatives, it's the best answer for this is that conservatives self-select into the military. Most of the people that go into the military come from the South. Most of the people that go into the military are pretty conservative. Same thing seems to be true for the police. And so, like, given these realities, I think that it's very hard to say, well, let me put it to you like this. Assuming that we don't do any reformism and the military just stays as it is right now, why would we think that we'd have any realistic chance of winning a revolution in the United States if the military is gonna stay like 7/10 of the side on the bourgeois, and even more than that, right? Supporting Barack Obama is not the same thing as supporting socialism, but let's say even just 7/10 stick with the bourgeois. Is it possible to win in that
Well,
situation?
I mean, want me to take it?
Sure.
you can. I had some
Uh,
ideas, but you got it.
okay, you can follow up after me. But I
Mm-hmm.
I think it's worth saying that, like, half of the work of the revolution, at least beforehand, is to create class consciousness, right? These people who are, coming from the South and enlisting to be a police officer or a military person, um, they're not educated in class consciousness, right? These are lumpen people. Um
Sure.
And they're normal people. They're not like some elite core of Southern society. Generally, they have pretty standard. I don't have data to support this, but I think we can all agree that like they pretty standardly have the same views as their community, right? Because they're affected by the same material in it. Um, so the work is going to be going into those communities and not just convincing military members, but to convince people with all types of reactionary beliefs to come onto the side of the revolution. And that's the work that goes in beforehand.
And
So
I
it's not
could totally believe that, but then the question becomes like
Wake up,
through what
liberal.
is our best
I
vehicle
love
of
you.
achieving that? Is it through creation of like these paramilitary groups which are violent? And I can show you like a dozen studies that show that people hate groups that are perceived as violent, really, really hate them. There's even a study I could show you that using terrorism tends to reduce the likelihood of success in war by like 15 times or something. People really, really hate groups that are perceived as terrorists. Why is it that this paramilitary group is going to do more success than someone like Bernie Sanders or AOC? Who's going to reach more minds and change more hearts, even to move in the direction of socialism? Is it like the paramilitary Maoists, or is it going to be like the DSA?
Well, it's odd to characterize the Maoists as exclusively or I dare I say exquisitely, paramilitary.
Well,
But,
it's more just like the argument here
yeah, I
seems
mean,
to be
I
that like the
understand what you're
protracted
saying.
people's war is the way to
Yeah,
do this, right? So it's the
yeah,
paramilitary
yeah,
organization
and I
rather than
understand
just
what you're yeah,
Maoism through reformism, right?
yeah, well, Maoism doesn't do but, like, if we're
Maoism.
looking at it, right, like so let's take the reformist
Wake
angle.
up, liberal.
Okay,
I
I
love
can
you.
tell you that the Maoist Party of the Philippines, the Naxalites as well in India, have better
Wake up, liberal.
protections
I
for
love you.
LGBTQ people than the imperialist states that they live under. I can tell you that the Philippines Maoists had the first gay marriage in the Philippines, right? But deeper than that, I can tell you that there is no small correlation between um, education at a high bourgeois level
Mm-hmm.
and becoming well versed in socialism, right? Like I can tell you that Shay and I, both of our first exposure to socialism would have been at a really bourgeois nerd summer camp, right?
Sure.
But the thing that we have to understand here is that, like, for example,
Mm-hmm.
when we're looking at this chart that's discussing the differences between officers and enlisted and their support for these two candidates. Well, John McCain was somehow, right? I say somehow, less of a war hawk than Obama in this election.
I,
I should know. I remember, right? Because John McCain, being the vet, is gonna have an odd bumper with facts, right? They're gonna say that, "Oh, he believes me, he understands me," right? Just look at it, just the numbers here. They're gonna agree with him to a marginal degree. That'll matter, A. B, the idea is one of the ideas we have to understand, military people, when polled, don't tend to like war.
Sure,
Now
I think
you'll
that's true
have
as far as I've seen.
brutes like war, right? Grunts like war. Well, no, actually not grunts, pogues like war, and that's person other than a grunt. Grunt hates war. Like, I have family that's in the military. They don't like it, and I call them bastards because all military are bastards. But, I mean, it's really a lot of like, you're advocating for reformism, right? Well,
Hmm.
I do have a question. I've watched some of your videos and researching for this. I'm uncertain as to what you would even define as socialism. Like, what state
Sure,
can I look at that shows me what you want, or something like that, that can give me a strong example of what you're advocating for? Because I don't even think that we
sure.
advocate for the same thing.
That's a good thing. Why don't we just go around then and maybe ask each person what their definition of socialism is? So I am a reformist, democratic socialist, right? So that's how I want to get there, and a market socialist. So I don't. At this, I used to be more of a planner. I think we talked a little bit before the stream about People's Republic of Walmart and Read Plenty, and there's a whole bunch of other good books in that vein that are that are more dense. But I moved away from central planning and I moved towards markets because I tend to think that there's just so much evidence that competition seems to increase productivity. I still want like an enormous state, quote unquote, socialized investment. Um, Basically, to me, socialism would look like a, a bunch of sectors where markets are composed entirely of cooperatives, where the state does an enormous investment into R&D because private firms don't invest nearly enough, and where the state does an enormous amount of redistribution such that no person can ever become quote unquote bourgeois. And I quite like the definition of bourgeois that a modern study used, which is having enough capital that you can subside off of its capital gains without doing any labor. And the reason for that, a reason that I mentioned that, is that the old like 1850s way of thinking about the bourgeois as like factory owners or whatever is it just doesn't exist. Like Bill Gates is one of the richest people on earth and he owns 1% of Microsoft. His money isn't tied up in one factory anymore. It's wealth in general. You got to get rid of wealth in general, collectivize it, horizontalize it. Um, you can't just like you can't just collectivize the means of production. So the examples of countries I would point to in terms of equality are stuff like I don't know, like 1980s Sweden, the Meidner model, like collective bargaining in Sweden. Um, that's not nearly enough, but like those are like good examples of reformist steps that we'd see on the steps to socialism. All right, which one of you wants to go first? I know that was a little long, but
Shay, you wanna go?
I'll let you go first. I want to hear what you have to say.
Okay. Well, I don't know if you know this or not, cooperatives aren't considered socialist by most socialists. Um,
sure. I mean, this is something we
they
could also talk about, but
Yeah, I mean, like,
I'll let you finish your
so
model
I
first.
don't yeah, my bad. I don't I mean,
My bad.
so what does socialism look like for me? Well, after war communism up to Stalin, right? This is a good time for the Soviet people. Um, After the Long March up to the death of Mao, right? This is a good time for the Chinese people, right? Notably Hoxha, right? Up until Hoxha dies, Albania, socialist, right? It looks like, you know, yes, there are still bourgeois, but the bourgeois are on the run, and there is a strong dictatorship of the proletariat. The people strongly hold in their possession the means of production, right? I don't care about wealth per se. I don't really see it as such because I come from an economics background. As far as I'm concerned, on the basis of wealth doesn't tell me so much as on the basis of the exact intimacy with labor and the exact intimacy with their means of production, which would determine alienation, etc. For me, these are more important. But it looks like a strong a social safety net, right? It looks like everyone being guaranteed food to eat, everyone being guaranteed a house, everyone being guaranteed, the things that make the house work. A job, guaranteed employment is huge for me, right? For me and for seeing what the people need. And it means, most strongly for me, a society that works to combat capitalist structure and but mainly capitalist thought, capitalist culture in a place,
Mhm.
um, it's a place where competition isn't what is valued, but if it is valued, then we see it in the context that, competition would be best if everyone could have the same starting point, and if we could guarantee that to everyone, because then, it would be on success on that person's, own abilities instead of on inheritance or some other outside factor, right? Um, so I think that gives that gives some, real world examples, but also just some major concepts for me.
Alright, I'll go ahead.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, for me, really, it's just look to history. You look at, Stalinist and Leninist Soviet Union, you look at Mao in China and, with some tweaks, right, because these things were not perfect and they
Mhm.
require some adjustment to be, done again in the next, socialist state. But these people had guaranteed employment, they had, um, you know, better lives than they did beforehand, and I think most importantly for me is really, like, reduction of alienation, right? Because so much of capital impressing on you is that of alienation and the symptom, right? Right. The condition that a lot of people say just to live, right? It sucks. It sucks to be alienated. And so, you can have guaranteed employment to some extent. You can in a welfare state, right? You can guarantee some of these socialist looking policies through reformism, but the biggest part to me is the combating of capitalist hegemony over the mind and the Cultural Revolution. That's really the biggest distinction is the withering away of the alienation that it causes and the opening of the mind into the next reality and the evolution of the true communist state.
Sure. So I guess, like to me, most of the policies, full employment, I think, has a lot of flaws, and I think that I've mentioned before. I think planned economies have a lot of flaws, and we can discuss whether like co-ops or markets can be socialist. Um, but to me, most of these policies very much sound like policies that you could enact with a sufficiently powerful reformist movement. I know the example I cited is Sweden. A lot of people got mad at me in chat. Um, because obviously I'm not saying Sweden is socialist. What I was saying is that an example is like the Rehn-Meidner model in Sweden, which did sectoral bargaining. Each industry in Sweden, I don't know if it's to this day, but it was for like several decades. I think from like the 60s to 80s at least. Um, would had equal wages. Every person who like works in sector like welding would have the same wages, maybe adjusted for like years of experience. And there was an additional plan called the Meidner Plan, Meidner, which basically what it would have done is forced every business over like 500 employees to have a union, and then it would force those businesses to over time give ownership to that union. And so to me, these seemed like very simple ways to transfer the ownership of the means of production to the workers. Now, obviously, it would still be in a market context, and you clearly don't agree with that. So I guess the question I would
No,
ask is like,
I mean, the
go ahead.
now the USSR notably had markets. Maoist China notably has markets. What we need to be very, understanding of, I guess, is what we're considering the by your definition of market, because from mine, right, quote, unquote, "small business" more or less thrives under every Marxist-Leninist, and then there's a, slash Maoist model that I've ever seen. Because what ends up happening is, as this social safety net expands, we see this large growth in, not a small business owner, but in someone who can produce, say, an artisanal thing for themselves, someone who can run a business that is themselves and, their family, right? There's no reason to have a worker class under that because it's based on the idea that Why would you go work for the local hat maker? The hat maker can make hats. That's why he gets the money from selling hats in exchange for, like labor script, um, etc. But even more deeper than that, it's the idea that like you're you you need full employment so that people can have, you know, the right to live? I guess, I'm very
Well,
odd
but how
I'm very
so, right?
odded
What
out
is
by
it
the
about the right
concept.
to live that is contingent on having work, full time work? Like at any given
Right
time in the
to
United States, for
employment
example, fifty
doesn't
percent of
mean
people
that
aren't in work. The old, the young, the sick.
yeah, okay, so right to employment does not and guaranteed employment does not mean that I come and grab grandma out of bed at 5 a.m. and make her work at the coal digging factory. It means that she can retire in greater dignity because she has done her work for society, and we can say as a society, "Oh, you're guaranteed a job," meaning you're guaranteed a wage, and we don't have to worry about that. I can promise you right now today that under a Maoist model, under an earlier ML model,
Hmm.
you don't have to pay taxes. I can promise you that
Well,
your
that's
wealth
not
is yours,
true.
but I also can promise you that you don't have to worry about that wealth. No, 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 I can promise you that. That's a thing.
Like the USSR had what are called invisible or hidden taxes. Paul Cockshott actually talks about this, where they just inflated the price of goods such that it would be equivalent to you paying the tax plus the price of good, where the tax goes and pays for all the social services. Like it was basically a consumption tax, which is actually highly regressive. So it would have been better
Which
if
is
they'd
a
played an
late
income
stage
tax.
USSR. Notably, I'm referring to up to the death of Stalin. I,
Well, but
fully reject
that's how they
Khrushchev.
always did it. Like
Nope.
I okay, then how did they pay for stuff
What
prior
do you mean?
to, like, how did they pay for like schools, right? Where'd the money come from?
Are you are you kid kidding? Okay, so let's consider the school. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You are guaranteed, and let's say you have decided, God help you, to be a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
So you go to high school or whatever the equivalent. You go to, you know, your college, your university, where you get competent to teach college or to teach, high school, whatever. You're gonna go teach a high school. You're gonna go be a fucking high school teacher. So
Okay.
guess what? While you're waiting to get that employment in that high school, you're guaranteed a job. This is important. We don't have that now. No democratic socialist countries ever had this, right? Because it would fuck with your capitalist market. It would remove that labor that you rely on, right? But where does the wealth come from to make this school? Well, while you're waiting on the school to get built, because notably the capitalists before you did not build a, you know school because
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't profitable, and there's no reason to make a co-op charter school there because again it's not profitable and there aren't enough children. But now the socialist state has stepped in and they will make they will make a nice fine school here. So this has now employed your builders. This has now employed your masons, your carpenters, etc., who can now go on and do something else. So the
Wake
wealth
up,
that was
liberal.
quote
I
unquote
love you.
needed to create that, um, isn't
Well,
needed.
just
It's only needed in a very odd, um, you know, idealist capitalist model. I mean, where does the wealth come from for modern states? Oh, you're gonna say taxes?
taxes.
Well,
Yeah.
not really, no, because these are states that
Yes.
can print wealth, and beyond printing wealth,
Uh,
these are states that can create digital currency of value. There's there is no reason, like, you know, look at these modern, I'm thinking, even a modern, basically, lifeline capitalist state like China doesn't have to rely on private firms paying private firms this money to do something. They can just make a thing.
okay. Why don't we just the simple example of the school, right? So the teacher. So they get paid a wage. They get paid a wage in rubles. Um, so where do those rubles come from? Now, your answer could either be they print money, right, which is MMT. And I think MMT is like at odds with any sane economic theory, and particularly Marx's theory. So I don't
Yeah,
think it's a good
truly,
way
it
to
is.
say they just print money. But Like, let's assume they just do print money. How much money are they printing such that they can pay for the entirety of social services? Like, the inflation in the United States is like 2% per year. We increase the money supply by like 2%. Is that enough to pay for like all social services? Or do we take
So
money out
what
of
do you
circulation and put it back into
consider a
schools?
source of value? I just wanna be clear, what do you consider to do or imbue value into a thing?
So people are going to get mad. I used to believe in labor theory of value. I no longer think there's sufficient evidence to support it. I think the evidence for it is weak. But
So what do you believe imbues a thing with value?
sure, I think that at this point, the strongest theory seems to be that like quote unquote value is a subjective thing. So subjective theory of value determines prices. If what we mean by value is prices, um, there's just not enough evidence to support the idea that labor theory of value properly explains prices of goods.
Uh-huh, okay. Um, Shay, do you wanna defend LTV real quick while I drink the tea?
Based.
I can try. I well, I don't think that, um,
Sure. If
when we look
some people in chat are complaining about price versus value, why don't we start there? Do you think there's a distinction between price versus value?
yes.
Okay. What do you
Yeah.
think the distinction is?
Well, if I sold you a sandwich for $4 that cost me $4 to make, then, the pr well, fuck. If I sold you a sandwich for $6, it cost 4 fucking dollars to make. There's a difference between price and value because the value of the sandwich is $4. Took whatever 50 cents for the bread and the meat, and then it took 3.5, bucks of my time. I mean, even in a modern context, right? If a firm, right, and if a firm in normal functioning capitalism, whatever that may be, were
Mm-hmm.
to ever break with the line of, it has to produce the thing for profit,
Sure.
then that firm would rapidly go under because that firm would undercompete. This is just us following, you know, childish capitalism.
Okay.
So if it's not beneficial then for that firm, the firm will not engage in it. There's a difference between price and value because if there was not, then the firms would infinitely spiral upwards in cost, like, far above something as simple as inflation, right? Because
What?
firms cannot simply deal in the real. If firms dealt in the real, the most highly valued company in the world would not be some random company, some random tech
But
corporation.
do you think that like the labor theory of value is actually a good explainer for like Facebook?
Yeah, because Facebook's a commodity. It just
So,
you are the commodity. It creates infinite commodities by using you inputting your godforsaken time into its algorithms, which are there
sure.
to
Why don't we just do
extract
like another
value.
example, right? Let's just do software. So let's say
Okay.
like I don't know Streamlabs or something, right? It took one person how many hours to produce it, but once they've produced it, it requires very little hours to increase that production. How can
Mhm.
we say that labor is a great explainer for the time that went into that? We could talk about like embodied labor or something, but that gets much more complicated than like simple labor theory of value. I,
As we know, labor well, as we know, that which is created by labor, right? That capital is vampiristic and also a zombie. It outlives even the laborer, right? This is a thing that we should know, right? So
sure,
what
but
we
so
have to
sure. So then if all we're saying is that capital can like hold labor value, then how are we ever going to actually calculate the labor value of a product? We would have to calculate the labor value of literally everything that's been in existence as like a product since like the industrial revolution to properly count up all the labor in the current things. If you believe in this like if you truly believe in like a strong embodied labor value theory.
I mean, you follow an equation. You don't have to predict every single option within the market of labor. You simply have to have a baseline which says the state has decreed that digging ditches in Kazakhstan while it is flooding is worth $50 an hour. if you decide to go dig this ditch, we will now pay you $50 for an hour of standing in the hurricane, which is causing the flooding in Kazakhstan.
I,
So because in this situation, this labor was more valuable, we are doing that. Now looking at coding, right? The state has decided that it's actually time to follow, glorious leader Deng Xiaoping, not so much into the model of we need a state Facebook. So actually we're gonna pay you guys to make a Facebook that will help us track what our people are doing. And in making this form, we will pay you, etc. We don't need specific numbers on a specific company. That doesn't matter. We have an
well,
abstract. This is even looking at your model, which again is not socialist. Most people don't like the Rand Minder model. Even that would say, "Oh, well, we don't have to account for every market decision. We just have to account for we have to allow these unions to
so,
decide, oh, yeah, if you're a welder, but you only been welding 2 years, you're probably not so good as that 50-year welder over there. So maybe you're worth a little less."
sure. So just to try to return a little bit to the beginning, I just asked, what do we think value is, and why is it different than price? So we can talk about all that in a moment. But what do you think the distinction is?
I mean, why not use value? Of course, that's subjective, but it's not like a Louis Vuitton luxury item, which is worth $10,000 has much more use to me than a normal handbag.
Well, but that's actually that's actually a good example that like market power seems to affect prices. Even though the labor that goes into a Louis Vuitton bag and like Walmart bag or whatever is not very dissimilar, the Louis Vuitton one costs 5 times as much. Do we think the labor theory value can really explain market power?
I think there's sufficient evidence to say that the Louis Vuitton bag is not necessarily a commodity. Luxury
But
items as such have a certain uh,
well, but
you
luxury
know,
isn't a binary, right? Everything has some degree of luxury. Everything has some degree of branding and market power. Like Apple is an enormous product. It's like I want to say like a third of all phones and like a fifth of all computers or something. And it's paid a lot more for, not necessarily because it's better, but because it's got a brand on it. I think it's if you want to exclude luxury goods from your explanation of the economy, you're excluding like 50% of goods or something along those lines.
Now, question. So, okay, using the Apple example here, what we're looking at in the difference between price and value on an iPhone, as opposed to, say, Apple's not even the largest manufacturer of smartphones. It's not the most common smartphone. The most common smartphone is, I believe, an Android. Um,
Sure.
which which would be a really good example because it would show us, right, the power of some like something even deeper than baseline ideology. Something deeper than ideology as such is the idea
Mm-hmm.
of marketing. Now,
Well,
under
but
any
then it's
model
not
of
labor theory of
socialism,
value.
I
It's
would
labor
quote
theory of
unquote
value plus
huh?
subjective theory of value. It's that like everything has a labor value and there's
No,
also
no, 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 no.
subjective
There's
value.
still labor here. There's still labor here because the value
But
is the
there's labor
same.
in the subjective theory of value. Like basically what I'm asking is what differentiates this theory of value from the subjective theory of value?
Price is not value.
Sure, then what is value? What is the distinction?
Value is either the labor use value or the accrued labor plus materials that went into making the thing. That's
Okay,
all
but
value is. Value has
sure,
nothing
but
to has very little to do with price.
sure, but then all we're trying to assert that value is like the cost of production, right? So if this is true, then how is this different than the subjective theory of value? In like only difference this is asserting is that labor is like the ultimate determinant of the cost of all production, right? But if you're talking about like the actual prices on the market, trying to explain that, the labor theory of value doesn't explain that. All it would care about explaining is the prices of production, right?
No. I mean, because when again, yeah, so price is from the exchange, quote unquote, value of the object. Now I can sell a damn shovel to Shay for the $10 I got it for at Home Depot, homeless despot, or for $20 Better yet, 25. So now I get 5 to take home, and I have 20 to go buy 2 shovels so I can sell double to the next idiot. Okay? So what we have to do is what we have to understand here, right, is that the exchange value, yes, incorporates a subjective level. This is why we don't call it exchange value, we call it price, right? Because at this point, if I paint
Sure.
an iron shovel with gold spray paint, I've used a little bit of labor and a little bit of materials to make this thing more appealing to Shay, who will now buy it. If we look at something like a software, if we look at Facebook as an example, just as an example, Facebook UI used to suck. Facebook UI used to be less than it is now, right?
Okay.
Used to be uglier, used to be less appealing, and if we follow the neoliberal framework for modern economics, then we would say, oh, because it was less appealing is why fewer people used it, right? So, as we made it more appealing, as we put more labor into it, as we put more time and effort into it, more things went into making Facebook better, right? It improved. And even if we look at non superficial things, we see that, oh, actually, the only reason people use some social media over others is marketing and is a popularity, which comes down to the quote unquote exchange value, which is really just the price of the thing.
I,
Because
sure.
again,
So
that
then, what
exchange
is the labor
value is
theory of value
different.
exchanging? Right. So if all we're asserting is that like the quote unquote value is the price of production, so then the question just becomes like, can labor better explain this? That if exchange value, we're just going to say is price. It includes like marketing, includes all these subjective things, and labor theory value can only explain like the cost of production. Then like it seems like the subjective theory value people can pretty well explain like the prices that firms come to. Um, there's
Okay,
actually
so there are laws that govern price that, as we can see, don't govern labor as equally, right? We see that things cost more than being produced, then we have to raise something, right? We have to change to some extent, right? Your basic high school econ course does in fact apply, right? But what we're saying is the actual value of the thing, the
sure, but
the
let me
actual
put it like this:
price
how do
at
you know that
which
that
a
is the actual value? Like, let me basically, I'm trying to say it like this. Let's say that this is your theory and it's totally fine. Why should we accept this? Like, what use does this theory have for explaining economics, for explaining the world to us?
because we're not attempting to. Okay, so here's where the issue is coming from that I can see, right? If you were going off of a non-revolutionary model, there would be no reason to use labor theory value because, right? If you were going off that model, you would say that it is best to simply reform what we have now, and what we have now clearly shows that line continues to go up. Line going up equals more gooder, and as long as more gooder, everyone's happy. Whereas when Marx is giving us this labor theory of value, when we are looking at the labor theory of value, we are looking at a revolutionary change in how economics is done because we have to understand, right, that there's something beyond just now, right? So, of course, when there are few producers, we have higher prices because they have the ability to do so, to raise them. But when there are more producers, and the buyers have gained this power of choice. The price is lower than the cost of production, but always things are relative to that cost of production, which is that labor
Sure.
value.
So the reason that I bring this up is like the main studies that people cite on this come from, as far as I can tell, the main ones that people cite, and these are the ones that I cited, were from like Scheich and Cockshot. And so like the arguments that Scheich cites, the reason that he argues that prices equivalate around that labor theory of value price, right? That there's this price of production, and that the actual price of the good like is somewhere in that range. Mostly seems to be that like the examples that he cites are that over a business cycle, the price changes. Oh, let me go get it. I have this graph somewhere. Um, Really? Basically, I don't want to miscite this. The argument that Scheich raises, so I can't find the graph, but the argument that Scheich raises is that over the course of a business cycle, the price changes. I forget if it's more or less than the actual change of the commodity itself. And so his argument there is that, well, you see that the change in the commodity doesn't line up with the change in the price. So clearly this proves that there's something like inherent to the price that fixes it, that it can't change. But you could easily explain this using a non-labor theory of value. If you wanted an objective theory of price, you could just assert something like, hey, energy theory of value. Maybe it's the energy that goes into it that it equilibrates around. How do we know the labor theory of value is the correct one? Similarly, basically, I'm just saying the arguments that they're raising don't allow differentiation between quote unquote objective theories of value. And they can easily be explained by stuff like sticky prices. The idea that prices change they can't change as frequently over time as do supplies of goods. So what I'm saying is that this theory, it could be totally true, but we'd have no way based on the empirical evidence to know that it's actually being true. That would be more clear if I got the graph. But hello? Hello? Oh, can you not hear me? Oh shit. Discord's taking us down, boys. The CIA knows.
I've
Hello,
been
hello?
talking,
Oh,
went quiet.
I
Yeah,
couldn't
it
hear
looks like the
anything.
voice. It looks like the voice
So I
just
started
reconnected.
talking.
Okay.
Okay, so um,
So what I was asserting is that the theory that you're raising is it's would be useful if it were predictive of the prices of production. And so the problem is that the evidence that people usually cite for this, as far as I can tell from people like Scheich, is just really weak. So for example, this is a graph from Anwar Scheich, which shows that over the course of a given business cycle, the change in output is much larger than the change in prices. And so his assertion, therefore, is that, hey, since prices change less than output, clearly there's something about the prices that is objective and that markets are forced to equilibrate around that even when output changes dramatically. But I think this can be very easily explained with a combination of sticky prices. Firms are reluctant to change their prices because they have long-term contracts and because they don't want to change stuff in the market. And two, just by the idea, if you wanted an objective theory value, you could easily say, well, the reason that it doesn't change is there is something objective about prices, and it's energy or some other objective metric. How do we know that this is due to labor? That's basically the question.
Uh,
yeah.
I mean, this might be a dumb point, but I don't know how much use there is in trying to apply the value of labor into a capitalist system, right? I feel like the
Sure.
reason that we have this value theory is for in the future when we whittle away the need for subjective prices in the market, right? We're still going to use them in the evolving socialist state, but whenever we do abolish the commodity, then value is going to be inexplicably tied to labor, and we're just not in that society now, right? There's a lot of marketing forces and subjective forces that determine the price of something, right? But its latent value, its inner objective value will be able to be seen into the future when we enter the post-commodity society. So I don't think there's necessarily compelling evidence that it exists now, but what's the compelling evidence that value will be subjective into the post-commodity society?
And before you hop on that, you're citing Cockshot. Now Cockshot has provided ample empirical analysis justifying the labor theory of value. I don't particularly like Cockshot, but he has. If you're gonna cite him, you may as well read
Sure.
this.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying. I'm
But
saying that his
yeah,
arguments are weak. If you one of his lectures that he uses, I literally have a graph for one of his lectures, is this correlation you can see right here, where he shows that the number of person years, the amount of labor that's in a given sector, is highly correlated with the pounds that sector is valued at. And so he's like, yes, this is a proof that the output in money is closely correlated with the labor input in money. And so the problem with this is, if I remember correctly, I was talking with a friend of mine, and you can just look at like size of a sector, and it easily correlates. What you're just talking about here is that bigger sectors have more people employed. You find these like very very weak correlations, very weak evidences for it, and so I think we
Okay, so
actually. Sorry, go ahead.
here's one thing. Again, like I was saying, labor theory of value holds, I guess, a value of itself, you might say, for revolutionaries in that it shows us a model for to what degree exploitation is present in a market, right? It shows us the exact value and a way and an equation to use to understand and anticipate the value of what a worker is doing in a market. And then everything basically above that is to degree of to which they're exploited, right?
But
But because you're coming at it from this other angle, you're gonna see it in a reformist way, right? You're gonna say, well, exploitation is inherent, but it's measured in however you would like to measure it. Ultimately, the difference between reformism and revolution is how much suffering do you want to justify, right? I cannot justify for myself all that much more suffering under any of the current systems that people deal with.
well, so that's
But if
interesting
you
though, because we can look at exploitation metrics even using subjective theory of value. I think I literally have
like
like
what,
uh,
Gini coefficient?
so Gini is just about inequality.
Yeah,
But
I
like
mean, I don't even like
a
Gini.
simple example. I mean, I think inequality is highly correlated with exploitation. But like a simple example, we could just look at output per hour in the which is just using subjective prices versus labor prices per hour. And so by this estimate, the average American produces $64 per hour, and the average American earns $28 per hour. Now, you got to do the things that Marx talked about. You got to deduct for the cost of depreciation of capital, you got to deduct for administrative expenses and all that. Once you take away all that, the remainder is the difference between someone's quote unquote output and their quote unquote earnings. And so, if your desire was a totally equal playing field where everyone was paid the same wages, then that number, that difference,
Wake
would
up,
be equal to the
Libra.
exploitation,
I
even
love
under
you.
subjective theory value. I don't think you need the labor theory value to explain to someone, hey, you're
No,
producing
if labor has
$64
no
an hour, but
value
you're only getting paid 29.
if labor has no value creating function, then the surplus value inherent in this model that you're showing me wouldn't matter. Because it wouldn't mean anything, because it would just say,
So
"Oh,
the
that labor
because
is under all of this." No,
so
labor is the seminal
one
component
of the
is
things
what
that
we're
I
saying.
found that's very frustrating is when I believe in labor theory value, having to do this like 30-minute empirical, like not empirical, theoretical discussion to explain here's labor theory value, here's like why it matters, here's how it determines the cost of goods, and here's why it means that you're being exploited. You can explain all of that in an even more effective way, in my opinion, by just looking at, like, say, hey, inequality is inefficient. Inequality reduces growth. Inequality hurts people. It leads to poverty. If you want a more equal society, this is a measure of exploitation. Things should be more fair. It's much easier to explain exploitation through the lens of just you produce more than you get
Wake
than it
up,
is to have to do
Libra.
this whole
I love
theoretical
you.
like dance with LTV. Um,
Most people don't sit down in the cadre at night and go over the LTV.
yeah, most
I
people don't read theory. That's going to be
Yeah,
there.
that's the point. You don't have to.
Well,
LTV is an inherent thing.
then what is the utility of like debating it so extensively? Let's say that it were true, just for a moment. Let's say that it were totally true. Why does it matter to the process of like agitating for socialism? If it's just relevant, if your argument is just like it's true, the claim that most people don't read theory is just totally empirical to people in chat. Like you can look at what people in like even socialist societies read, and they don't read theory. They don't read Marx. They don't read any of the seminal books. They read fiction. People don't want to read theory. The, if it's true, let's say it's totally true, then the argument like there is just like this is an empirical theory that's maybe relevant to the socialist society, but as we've noted, it's not even useful for explaining the current society.
Did you
I
ever,
think the use it has
go ahead, Shay.
isn't necessarily like how ambitious your project can be, right? When we use the subjective labor theory and we present it unto the people, like in your case in this reform, there's going to be a certain um, margin for which um, prices can be unexplained, right? Because you're still gonna be using the prices, and you're going to level out into a system which still has commodities in it, in the reformist path, right?
I
So
mean,
when you
the
get to
the
the
argument for
goal,
commodities is that any market will have commodities. So I don't think that LTV or labor theory, like LTV could be true and you could be market socialist and there would still be commodities.
yeah, I didn't finish, is that the point is that in the revolutionary line, the goal eventually, God knows how we'll get there, is to end up in a post-commodity society, which the subjective theory of value cannot reach into.
I I mean, sure, that's like that could be one way you perceive of this, but that would just mean so this isn't okay. I think to pull back a little bit from labor theory value and return a little bit to like the discussion of substance, regardless of the truth or falsity of the labor theory of value, most of the policies that we seem to discuss for like a socialist society, with maybe the exception of planning versus markets, which is I know a big one, and full employment versus like some level of unemployment. Aside from those, most of the policies we seem to agree on. We seem to agree on like socialization of investment, of like public free housing for everyone, on and on and on. So, the if we agree on these policies, then to get back even further, the question was like, how do we get there? How do we get to these policies? And so the argument that I raised that we originally got to here is it seems like people like AOC and Bernie Sanders have done more for advancing like people being aware of socialism than has like any Maoist, any socialist like sect like not sect any revolutionary socialist organization in the United States for like 80 years.
No, no, they haven't. I'm actually mildly oh, Discord cut out again. Discord cut out.
I can hear you.
You can hear me?
I
I
don't,
can't
and
hear
to
you.
be clear, I don't think AOC or Bernie Sanders are like socialist. I think that the point is just like even having these
Oh,
reformists can enormously change the conversation.
no,
Yeah,
because
and
again, neither of these people want anything that helps the workers. They just want what they want, right? These are both people who
What
are trying to
what they want
expand
often
their own
aligns with
line.
what helps the
Maoist in the
workers.
last 80 years has to include not only the Black Panther Party, but also it has to include damn hammer and sickle in the mountains of Alabama. Neither of these
Yeah, but all
people
of those
are
the
lessening exploitation. Both of these people are expanding drone strikes abroad. I mean, the
so
deeper issue here, what we're really seeing here is that, I mean, from your perspective, much of what you're telling me is essentially that if we equalize the amount of wealth different people had, then everyone would be better off because that would in fact lower inequality by definition. That's inequality, right? But I don't care how
it's
much
also about
wealth a person
capital
has. I'm
ownership,
not
right?
Bernie Sanders. I don't care if you're a millionaire or billionaire or trillionaire, you have $5 in the bank. If you work and you are a pro, I don't care how much money you're making, you're a pro. You're gonna have
Well,
the
that's actually
class
an interesting
distinctions of
one.
the pro unless you have a different ideological lens. And if that lens is given to you, if that lens is forced onto you by capital, then that lens has to function in the same way that we
So
understand the commodity, which is to say that it's being advertised to you. I mean,
one thing
this isn't a debate. This is just you're stonewalling, and we're gonna have to stonewall because we're Maoists. We knew we were Maoists when we came in, and seemingly you are going to continue to feel the same way. So it's not a debate.
I
So
mean, sure.
it's
So
just
the things that I would point to, right, is like you can just look at like people's changes in opinion, and people were not big fans of socialism through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. If the Black Panther Party worked, it didn't work at changing people's opinion. I could even argue the reverse thing. There are literally studies. I could post one which shows that like violent riots is correlated with people moving away from leftism if those riots are done by like left leaning or black organizations. And so it's very easy to believe we live in this media that's going to paint them as terrorists. It's going to paint them as violent, and people are going to move away from that because they're scared of it. Most people aren't going to read theory. They aren't going to like find a way to justify people who are violent.
if you
well,
can't meet people where they are and explain to them in a fruitful way why what you're doing for them is better for they the labor than what they currently struggle under. If whatever it is that you personally, not you, but just the general large Y you believes or thinks or or whatever it is that you're trying to sell to them, if you can't sell that as better than what they currently live under, Jesus Christ, what are you doing, man? I don't care
Sure, but they
if
aren't telling
people
them
like
those things.
socialism in 2020.
If I may,
The
if I
Black
If
may,
Panther
if we want to talk
Party
about
I
Bernie
don't
Sanders, right? One of his big things is worker ownership. It's literally like a move towards a co-determination model like Germany's, and like an enormous expansion of union rights.
sucks,
listen,
which
listen, listen.
features exploitation.
If we want to talk about the popularity of socialism, and Bernie Sanders expanding that, it's because people don't have the same understanding of socialism that they did in the 60s. Right now, socialism to people is welfare and Medicare for all. That's what socialism is. And of course it's popular because people like those things. But it's not they don't understand that it means revolution. They don't understand that it means worker ownership means production. If you're talking about polling data, then of course they're going to like it because these are positive material impacts. They don't have the deeper understanding of it. And that's why you
Sure,
have to create the institutions for class consciousness.
sure.
Wake
But then
up,
if we want to
liberal.
return even
I
further,
love
right,
you.
to the all the examples of the quote unquote institutions creating class consciousness, they are all being beaten back. The Naxalites in India own like 10% of the territory they owned like 20 years ago. The Philippines
People are
have seen like an
living
enormous
better.
decrease. The people in Peru are the estimate is that they killed maybe 25,000 people in like the 1990s to 2000s. In the most recent decades, they've killed like 100 people. These are just orders of magnitudes of difference in the power of these organizations. If they're changing people's minds, they don't seem to be doing it very well.
Are you so so just okay, buddy. Okay. Yeah. I don't dude, I mean, like, it's like if you choose metrics that are just gonna support what you want, then yeah,
Well,
that's
what
gonna be the
metrics should
case.
I look at? What metrics would lead me to believe revolution works?
Well, look at these states that have existed. Look at these states that
A
have
fucking
well,
history, I guess,
I mean,
right?
I mean, the Communist Party of India, Maoist, was formed in 2004. So they aren't even the ones here to have they've only been taking territory for so long, and they even had a merger in 2014. This is a
I,
lot of territory that they're holding.
I,
This was 2004. I mean, this is a lot of territory that they're holding on to, and regardless of that, overlooking how many bad guys they kill, overlooking how many people give a shit about them. If they're helping one person's life, if they're helping one pro, then they're doing more than any social democrat has ever fucking done. Because never forget that even under social democracy, you still got to go carpet bomb Yugoslavia, or you still got to go fuck with Afghanistan, or you still got to go do a social imperialism to bring back that wealth. If you're
well,
not exploiting them here, then you're exploiting them abroad. You're
well,
not
that's one of the things
advocating
that I would
for
point to.
socialism, you're advocating for capitalism in chains. It's
That's
socialism with Warrenite characteristics. That's all I'm hearing here.
one of the things that I would point to is we're also seeing this expansion of social democracy to the third world. This idea that so if you just look at like I know that government isn't socialism isn't when the government does stuff, but socialist or like social welfare programs are part of social democracy, are part of, to me at least, like the slow steady march leftward. And in the rich world, we've seen an increase from about 1% of GDP being spent on social welfare in like 1925 to about 33% today. It went from 1 in 100 of the
Because they have
bourgeois
to
profits.
appeal to the pros so that the
Sure,
pros
but
don't rise up.
they're doing that everywhere in the world. Everywhere in the
Yeah.
world is doing this. And so to me, this seems to be suggesting that like it's not we're not just like if we are getting all of our ability to sustain social democracy via imperialism, which I think is not the case. You can do the math; it's just not the case. But we can get into that in a moment. Um, Even if it were true, those imperialized nations are also moving towards social democracy. They're seeing like rising incomes, they're seeing rising standards of living, and a lot of that is due to these expansions of these social democratic programs. So,
I mean, yeah, if
what is
like
essential
Thomas
to
said,
social democracy that you got to go bomb people in the third world?
oh, you gotta ask Thomas that question because if these I mean, I couldn't tell you that, but I think that social democracy necessarily just, again, prolongs capital. That's why they're doing it in these countries because the conditions are so
Well,
bad that they have
then
to
are you an
slightly raise them
accelerationist?
every few years.
Then are you like, would you prefer that we rolled it all back?
You get accelerationism from what we're saying. No, what I'm telling you is this.
Well, I'm just saying, like, if it would
Capitalism
be better
ain't,
for
just
workers,
age
would
of
is it better to
imperialism.
prolong or not prolong capitalism?
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at. That's what I'm getting at. As the age of capital ages, capital must become empirical, it has to expand, but also capital has to become softer on the inside line. If capitalism didn't become softer toward the control group, right? Toward the bourgeois, toward the petit bourgeois, toward even some valued proles, then these people would lead the revolts. That's what we learned from the Bolsheviks. That's what we learned from looking at the model of Engels. Is that if we don't go in and if we don't work with your bourgeois, if you don't work with the people controlling things, and if you don't appeal to them and turn them into pro sympathizers, if you don't make class traders of them, then they're going to fail you. But that also works in the reverse. So for the capitalist class, right, for the capitalist state, it is their it is by necessity that they bring the prole in and turn the prole into a class traitor. They remove any sense of class consciousness from him and they replace it with fruitless identity. I mean,
Sure, then what's
if
the
I wanted to
suggestion?
win on the progressive stack, I would just tell you that, you know, as a queer black person from the rural South, I should know what is best for me, right? And I can tell you straight up that none of these people, nobody in Afghanistan thinks that Joe Biden is less hurtful than Donald Trump. They wouldn't even think Bernie Sanders was, because notably, Bernard would also have been drone striking them
Well, sure.
because that
So
was
let's
part of his model. I mean, just because the people are bombing Yugoslavia doesn't mean Yugoslavia is not being bombed. I
So
don't.
the question I was trying to ask is like, what is it that you think is inherent about social? So the two questions I asked were: one, if the bourgeois state does as what you're saying, and it makes class traders of the proletariat by giving them concessions, then it seems like your solution would be to take away those concessions and make them not class traders anymore. But like, do
Wake
you
up,
support
liberal.
prolonging
I love
capitalism
you.
because that's apparently what social democracy does, or do you support like shortening it, which to me very reads very much like quote unquote accelerationism?
Okay.
I mean, you can just say it, you can
Uh,
support it. I don't mind, but
I mean,
No, we're
I
not
wouldn't necessarily call
acceleration.
myself an accelerationist. I
We're
think
here to
that
support bringing class consciousness to people and improving their material lives. As you improve their material lives, as you bring them class consciousness, you de-alienate them. As the worker becomes de-alienated from his labor, as he becomes more intimate with it, as he better understands it, he becomes radicalized. That is the value of the People's War, which Mao brings to the table that Lenin could not. This is what we have to understand about the value of the mass line. Yes,
but it
sure,
doesn't seem to
most
work.
people, quote unquote, don't want to read theory. It does work.
Well, then
I
why
mean,
don't
this
we?
is how
But
Maoist
where are these
continues to
successes,
grow
right?
year after year after year.
I, the successes that you're pointing to are like 40-year long civil wars by groups that like hold very little territory, do very like have very little control of industry, and like this sort of alienation you're talking about, like that they are mostly restrained to violent actions at this point. I versus we could just talk about like there's been enormous expansion of like all like just a huge number of like various quote unquote mutual aid and like cooperative programs all around the world. If we want to talk about success, those seem to have done enormously more to like make people quote unquote closer to the means of production than have groups like these, which don't seem to be winning. The example that I ask is like there's no example of revolution like this in the first world. And since the 90s, the only example of successful like winning revolution is in Nepal, and even there, now the communists are running in elections. They're winning, but they're running in elections. I,
And those people I wouldn't consider to be anything resembling communists. You can use a name. China calls itself, China calls itself socialist or communist, or it's working toward it, socialist with Chinese characteristics. And it's not. It's patently not. It's patently neoliberal. Sure, it is lowering inequality by forcing rural peasants to become lumpenprole in the middle of a city, working 80-hour a week, make nothing. And that's what they're doing. Sure, inequality's lower, hypothetically. They
it's
have
not. China
access
is
to
very
more
unequal.
hypothetically. They're not doing better. They're not doing any better. They're not feeling any better. They're not de-alienating.
Well,
They're
actually, that's
continuing
an
to
interesting
alienate.
one. So this is one of those things again where So I agree with Marx that we should be ruthlessly critical of everything that exists, and in particular, I think one of the things to be critical of is his theory of alienation. Um, when we look at studies of actual studies of alienation, because he was a sociologist, but he was writing in the 1850s. He didn't have the same quality of like survey methodology and same data sets we do today. When we look at actual studies of alienation, the things that seem to correlate with alienation are stuff like not having worker management, having hostile management, not getting paid fairly, being unsure about safety, and so on. I can literally get a study about this. Um, it, this idea that it has to do with like quote unquote closeness of labor or like commodity production just doesn't seem to be the case. What people actually care about is stuff like cooperative ownership.
Hmm. Mommy. Hmm. So now you think that, just to be clear, that alienation just doesn't exist? I see.
No, it exists, but it doesn't exist the way that like we're talking about it here. It's that when you have like more inclusive ownership, that's what seems to make people less alienated. But we can empirically study this even under like capitalist systems.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm a little confused about what you're trying to say. So you like to what extent do you think alienation applies to people?
I like a lot. Work is like the enormous part of most people's lives.
Yeah. But what's your point? That it's not tied to intimacy with labor?
Well, it's that it's tied to like types of ownership. So if we want to talk about eliminating alienation, stuff like the things that Sanders talks about, higher minimum wages, like co-determination, unionization, the like cooperatives, these are the kinds of things that will, according to these studies, for example, in this study, they found that when people had less hierarchical, more horizontal organization of companies, it significantly reduced several measures of quote unquote alienation.
Well, what are you
So
using to measure alienation? You can't. It's not
sure,
like a concrete. You can't measure it. It's felt. It's very
well,
subjective and it's felt. And you can report like feeling less alienated. But one goes deeper into
I,
ideology the further out they think they come.
sure, but this is like you can measure feelings, and if you don't think that you can, then
I mean,
then Marxism isn't a scientific theory, right? Then you're measuring an unscientific, unmeasurable thing. This would be like saying, well, it's the soul, right? How much can I measure the soul? Then you're talking about things that are beyond the realm of science. For reference, this
I
is how
mean,
this study
the
defined alienation.
the science comes in with
The
the
science
dialectics
comes
of it and the
from the
progression of history,
dialectical nature, yeah. Because we
not
can
from the
see
Just
measuring
using
of the
dialectics,
alienation.
yeah, just using dialectics doesn't make
you
something
don't have
science.
to attach a number to something for it to be measurable.
Yeah, that's called like
You don't
qualitative
even have to
studies.
attach
But
a number.
I mean, like the structure of science is not just having a thesis and then an antithesis and doing this sort of like dialectic back and forth. It's like having testable predictions. I think that the Popperian idea of science is much more like workable than is just having like opposing ideas. Otherwise, you could say that stuff like I don't know, like crystal healing or something, which does have a thesis and an antithesis, is like science. That's called the demarcation problem.
Um, I mean, it's getting late here. We're gonna have to
That's fine.
go. Um,
I got one more
I got
question.
one.
Sure.
Yeah, I got a
I got one more
question. I
question.
think Shay also got a question.
Okay. And this might spiral off, but I kind of raised the point in the beginning that and like there is merit to what you say. The alienation could be decreased under social democracy, whatever. Like
Sure.
the biggest point and the biggest reason that I am drawn to the violent revolution and to the creation of the state from that is because reform isn't equipped to stand against capitalist forces.
So I guess the things that I would note is it doesn't seem like most revolutions have been either. And maybe the Maoist theory is, but Maoist China is now one of the most unequal countries in the world. Wealth ownership in
Yeah,
China is
Yeah,
as
because
unequal
of
as it is in the United
reform.
States. Well, but that's the point, right? They did a revolution, and then internally it was reformed. Every
Because their
revolution
material
has
was
that
not
sort of.
reformed.
I mean, it requires modification. Nobody's saying that like what Mao did was
Well,
perfect. We're
no,
very critical of him and the
that's
way
like
that
my
he did
point.
things.
If you can say, hey, the past revolutions didn't work, I can apply a similar thing to past reforms. We can all say, hey, the past didn't work. We've got new theories on how to change it. And the thing that I would assert is most of the reason that revolutions haven't worked is because the first world, like the United States, came and carpet bombed them, as you said. And if you want that to change, you're either going to need one, like a really, really strong revolution, which doesn't seem like it's happening. Just looking at the successes of these movements, you need to like somehow make the United States not do that. And to me, the best path for that is reform. If you want revolution in the third world, you got to make the United States stop killing them.
And just to be clear, what candidate is going to not kill them?
Even so, you mentioned Bernie Sanders before. Even you know what? Even Obama. If you look at civilian death rates under Obama and Trump, they are literally 10 times higher under Trump. There's even in the dumbest of things. There are
No,
I know it sounds dumb as
no.
hell, but even between neoliberal warmonger 1 and like conservative warmonger 2, there are differences. And so it is very reasonable to believe that we can elect anti-war candidates.
Can I ask you about Bush's civilian or what? That's a dumb question.
Can I
I
also
They're
I
they're
think
ask
really
you
that
high.
about what you think of drone striking Doctors Without Borders? Because,
Probably bad.
yeah, yeah,
well,
they've
that's just the way that these institutions progress,
yeah,
right?
there's
They
no
have to
way.
continually grow. They're just like capital. They have to continually ramp up in order to serve their function. That's why we see more
We've seen like
deportations under Obama than we do Bush, and that's why we
oh
will
that
see
that
more
one's
deportations under
I don't want to defend Obama too much, but that's literally an accounting thing. So like I again, I don't want to defend him too much, but under Bush they counted like persons deported. Under Obama they counted number of times deported, which included one person multiple times, often people who'd crossed the border over and over again. So like it's a little bit of a meme there. You can't it's not one to one. But like yes, he did increase deportations to some degree. Um the
I
the
mean,
Mhm.
he
broader
built the camps, right?
Um,
He built the detention centers. The
but
function of the institution of, Border Patrol and ICE was increased.
yes and no. The problem with this is that you need somewhere to house people. They built somewhere to house people coming across the border because there was this big migrant crisis, and so to some degree they did a good thing by housing people. To some degree they did an incredibly bad thing by leaving a system which was so easily exploited by someone who just wanted to deport people. Like
Oh, no. Oh,
well, yeah,
no.
the fella's gotta
Not the
live in a
housing.
dog cage. Hey, fellas, we gotta deal. I mean, here's the thing. Here's the thing. Here's the thing. Here's the thing.
do
Right?
you not want them to like? Where do you think they should house people who cross the border?
Oh, I
Let's
don't
assume
think that they
Obama can't
should
just like
imprison
eliminate.
people who cross. No,
Yeah,
he
but he
can.
can't
He
change that
can.
law.
Yes, he can. He held Congress for 2 years, and even he doesn't
They
even need
held
Congress. He
Congress.
could just stand there and write a bill. Nothing stops him at any point from shutting down all functions except what he's doing. I mean,
If this were
by
true,
your logic, Anne Frank was insured housing under the Nazi Party. If she just pretended not to be a Jew for 30 minutes, she would have gotten guaranteed housing by Nazis. Same logic
it,
here. Oh,
this is
if
like
we voted Hitler out, Strasserism would have killed fewer people. We can. These are objective things.
so
That's the same thing.
if we talked about like the camps in Turkey and Syria that are on the borders that they use to house refugees, like the point is to house people that are coming across the borders in ways that you can't handle. They already had like those detention facilities. They just built more of them because a whole lot of people came after a variety of like basically like coups and instability in Central America sent like
Who
enormous
did
waves
the
of people out.
coups?
Again, it's the United States. I'm not trying to defend Obama, but my point is like of all things to critique him on, this is not like a great one. It's
They're all tied in together, you know? You have to build the cages because you're displacing the people. So there's no good reason to work within electoralism, what was the point of this again? Why did we want
So
somebody who's not carpet
the
bombed the
point was
revolution.
trying to get at that there are differences between these people. Even Obama, when he did these things, like he's the one who created delayed something action for child arrivals, and Trump totally destroyed it. There are objectively differences between these candidates, even within like again neoliberal warmonger 1 and conservative warmonger 2. Like even between these there's like an enormous gulf, and when we're looking at it's hard to acknowledge it, I think, for people on like the far left, but when we look at the leftward shift of the Democratic Party, they're all talking about $15 minimum wage. Biden's talking about a pathway to citizenship. He's talking about doubling the number
None of
of
these
immigration
things are good
judges.
enough.
Like
None of these things are good enough. They're not building houses for these immigrants. They're building jails. I mean,
they
look,
aren't doing
we're
socialism
it's
because
late
they're
here.
like
We gotta hang up.
centrists.
We
I
gotta go.
agree. But if your goal is like to reduce the bombing of like South American countries by 50% or something, then it makes quite a difference whether like the types
No,
of
actually,
candidates
then
you're
I would vote
electing.
for Trump because even the Taliban just said Trump's going to bomb them less than Biden. Shit, I may as well vote for Trump. As the official state of our official
Wake
political
up,
stance of
Libra.
our podcast,
I love
we
you.
don't believe in the left. We're Maoists. I'm here to help people. I don't give a shit about what slave master is running the ship. I've never cared. I'm not going to care.
It's still a slave master.
There's still a slave master. If I saw the devil and the United States fighting in the street, I would take the side of the devil because he is the lesser evil. Good night.
Okay, thank you for coming on. Would you like to shout
Oh,
out your podcast one more last time?
he's gone.
It's okay.
Uh, Um,
One of you
Cool
is left.
Zone
You can still give me a
Podcast.
podcast. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
We're on Spotify and Apple Podcasting, where you can find your podcast. Subscribe to us on Patreon. We're doing exclusive content. We're having articles coming out, and of course, our exclusive series on the history of evangelicalism. Thanks for having us.
Of course. Apologies that it got a bit combative, but perhaps
It's all right.
inevitable
It's the
because we have
nature.
pretty divergent views. So
Yeah,
thanks for
and you
coming
know
on.
what? I'm happy to talk about it with you. So thanks again for your time.
Thanks. Have a lovely evening.
Too.